That must be the actual store for adventurers. Alexander murmured, narrowing his eyes as he watched a rugged-looking man flash an adventurer card and get waved through an inconspicuous side door. It is? Then what's all this supposed to be? Asked Rusty, now slightly perplexed. To him, keeping the better weapons out of the main store seemed counterproductive. Seems kind of backwards, doesn't it? Hiding the good stuff? Not really. Places like this often keep their best wares tucked away. It's a sort of unspoken rule a lot of stores follow. It's just mostly for safety reasons and saves them time dealing with people that don't have money. Alexander replied. Is that so? Rusty had never run a store before, so this was new to him. It seemed that the humanoids preferred to separate the cheap weapons from the expensive ones. He had only caught a brief glimpse inside after the adventurer stepped through, but he noticed an armed guard stationed within. The weapons on display were clearly radiating mana, which meant they were probably enchanted. The ones out here, on the other hand, were simple iron and steel, only suitable for F and E rank adventurers. Hey! That actually makes sense, but it's annoying when you're the customer. From a customer's perspective, such treatment would likely feel a little humiliating. It suggested they weren't even worthy of looking at the better weapons. Rusty wasn't entirely sure if he wanted to implement the same system, at least not before seeing what was inside for himself. He could also create enchanted weapons and wanted to understand how to price those items appropriately. While he could probably ask Rollo or the people inside the shop, he still preferred to see it with his own visor. Soon he made his way to the side door and mimicked what the adventurer had done, giving it a few solid knocks. With a metallic click, the slit opened, revealing a pair of watchful, unimpressed eyes. Who are you? Haven't seen you around here. Do you have any identification? The voice asked while scanning Rusty's gear. His current body bore no enchantments and he looked like an ordinary adventurer wearing standard steel-grade armor. Still, Rusty confidently pulled out his adventurer card and held it up to the slit to showcase it. The card shimmered in the light, displaying his current name, Edmund, and his rank of an E-rank adventurer. There was a long pause. The guard didn't move. Then, without a word, the slit snapped shut. Rusty stood in stunned silence and could hear the man muttering curses behind the door. But he knocked again, refusing to give up. The slit slid open once more, but this time the guard looked much angrier. Beat it! This isn't a place for E-rank adventurers. Either show me something worth my time or don't come back. Worth your time? Are you slow or something? Read the rules. The opening slammed shut again, leaving Rusty standing there, confused. He looked around for a moment, then finally spotted a weathered, rusted sign with faint words etched into its surface. Entry restricted. Verified D rank and above or proof of merit required. Rusty stared at the barely legible sign and felt frustrated. Although he had become a D rank creature, the adventurer card he carried belonged to someone who had died before advancing beyond E rank. Fortunately, there was one saving grace, the proof of merit, which offered another path forward. What is this proof of merit? He asked, and Alexander quickly answered. Probably something like a down payment. Some shops make customers pay a large sum just to view their better wares, kind of like an insurance fee. And people are okay with that. Most won't bother, but if you've got plenty of money, wasting a gold coin or two doesn't really matter. Well, in their eyes, you're an E-rank adventurer. Just another greenhorn trying to sneak a peek at gear you can't afford. It seemed the down payment existed to filter out casual browsers. It was likely meant to discourage those with hidden agendas or anyone who couldn't afford the merchandise and would only waste the store's time. I see. Rusty turned his attention to the person behind the store counter and walked over. After asking a few questions, he found out that obtaining the proof of merit would cost him a single gold coin. It wasn't a huge loss, but it still felt unnecessary. Given his current skills, he believed he could pass the D-rank adventurer test. Heading to the guild might be a better option. This is annoying. This felt like a setback since he had planned to examine the store's wares to understand what was selling. He also wanted to study the magical enchantments the humanoids were purchasing. That would help him decide where to focus his efforts and which materials to invest in. The twilight steel that made up his body was too rare to use for trade, so he preferred to keep it untouched. Instead, he hoped to observe where his competitors were putting their resources. As long as the items were made of metal and he had the necessary materials, he could theoretically replicate the weapons he had crafted. I wonder how the other blacksmiths are handling things. Although continuing here was no longer an option, there were still a few other shops and merchants he could visit within the district. After making sure a burden had memorized the general layout and all the prices of the regular items, he headed out. He spent the next few hours slowly walking through the settlement, examining equipment prices. Some of the smaller shops only offered standard weapons, most of which were unremarkable. Others, however, had hidden chambers where they kept their best wares. These merchants also refused to reveal anything without proper identification or a heavy coin purse, neither of which he had at the moment. As he continued to look around, a few things became clear. Some of the workers in the blacksmith shops and throughout the merchant district were slaves. Many dwarven individuals were forced to work in the smithies with collars around their necks. This was a common sight that no one seemed to care about. "What am I giving you food for?" "But sir, there are just too many of them." "I don't care. You're not getting any food until you sharpen all of these. Please, and no." While walking around, he came across a troubling scene between one of the dwarven slaves and the merchant who owned the smithy. The dwarf looked malnourished but was still forced to sharpen weapons in exchange for scraps of food. The owner showed no concern for whether the slave worked all day or through the night. The scene reminded Rusty that these people were capable of cruelty too. There was a strange darkness about them, a tendency to ignore uncomfortable truths or hide them beneath the surface. Others nearby could hear the exchange, but no one turned to look, as if even acknowledging it would bring trouble. Eventually, he reached one of the stores that sold raw materials, but another problem came up. "My what? Your buyer permit? You expect me to sell raw materials to you without the proper papers? Leave now before you get me into trouble." Rusty stood in stunned silence outside the shop. The door slammed shut behind him again and more curses came his way. "First I'm too low rank to buy a proper weapon, and now I need papers just to buy some ore? Where do I get this buyer permit?" He posed the question to his guides and Alexander was the one to answer. "Probably at the town hall again." Great! Another complication had appeared, one he hadn't expected. It felt like these humanoids tried to take a share of his profits every time money was involved. This clearly served as a tactic to keep new merchants from competing with the established ones. If he wanted to do business with them, he would have to pay once more and stay in their good graces, or he would need to find another way to secure ores and other materials for crafting. Now he faced a decision. He could head to the town hall and find out how much the permits cost, or he could go to the Adventurer Guild first and try to raise his rank. Perhaps with a higher rank, the cost of permits would be reduced. With that in mind, the next step was quite natural. Do I really need to go to the Adventurer Guild and go through one of those tests again? Previously, he had to team up with a few others and enter the dungeon to obtain the E-rank card under his former identity, Albert. He had since lost that card and replaced it with another identical one. From what he understood, each guild had the authority to issue promotions at their own discretion. While there were standardized tests in place, guild masters occasionally chose to ignore them. He was not sure what kind of test he would face, but a D-rank adventurer card would likely open many opportunities for him in the future. It was something he needed to address sooner rather than later. Silly Rusty, why bother with a test when you can just take what you need? As he considered his options, a burden suddenly spoke, his tone carrying a menacing edge. "Take? What do you mean?" "It's quite simple, my dear Rusty. Let's head to the dungeon now, kill a couple of D-rank adventurers, and take their cards." A burden cackled as if this suggestion were the most natural thing in the world. Although he could take someone's head and use it through possession, killing humanoids was not that straightforward. It was difficult to account for their relatives and acquaintances. Choosing someone indebted to the Thieves' Guild or involved with other shady individuals could create even more problems for him. "That's an idiotic idea, as always. Let's just go to the guild and ask around first." Omega. "Oh? I don't think that's a good idea, Gleam. What if they catch you?" As he prepared to head toward the guild, his little companion poked him with her antennae. She offered to sneak into the shops and gather all the information Rusty wanted. I still don't think that's a good idea. You'll be able to test your new armor some other time." Rusty chuckled. Gleam clearly volunteered because she wanted an excuse to try out her new suit of armor, which allowed her to blend into the shadows. As things stood, there was no real urgency. Even if they could not check out the enchanted goods right away, there would be other opportunities. They could always earn more money by hunting monsters in the dungeon or simply acquire a new adventurer card, which would solve the problem entirely. For now, let's just head to the guild. After a little back and forth, Rusty finally decided to head to the Adventurers Guild. The one in Ferndale was somewhat similar to the one in Argasa, but it was hard to ignore the flaws. The building seemed to be not as well kept and the training grounds outside were quite minuscule. It was clear that the people here had not been able to establish themselves well yet, but the state of the building didn't matter. What he needed was to get his D rank accreditation, and somewhere in there he should be able to do it. This could work in our favor, Rusty. If they didn't fully establish the guild here, then there is only one way to test adventurers. Oh, and that is... As they walked, Alexander brought up a point which made Rusty rather happy. Trial by combat. You mean? Yes, your favorite. With the lack of resources and the constant threat of monsters, it was normal for the guild to not be able to prepare proper tests like the large city he was in previously. There the guild sent out multiple people to keep watch over the F-rank adventurers and make sure that they wouldn't get hurt inside the dungeon. They even prepared traps and made sure any out of the ordinary monsters would spawn to kill them. Everything which then was affected by the strange cult and made things a bit more hectic. Nevertheless, this settlement didn't have the funds to spare, which left only one option: quick combat with an adventurer of an appropriate level and class. He eventually made his way into the guild. Inside, he saw the woman with large square glasses working once again. She and an old man had helped him register Gleam as his tamed monster, and she was probably the best person to ask about the guild's rank promotion test. After waiting for about 5 minutes, he reached her reception desk. The woman with auburn hair looked up at him with sharp eyes that shifted toward the bump in his robe where Gleam poked her head out. "Oh, it's you. How can I help?" At first, it was clear she didn't recognize him, but once Gleam appeared, her eyes changed. He couldn't be sure, but she seemed much more interested in his ant companion than in whatever he had come for. He cleared his possessed throat and got straight to the point. "I would like to achieve D rank. How can I go about that?" The woman looked at him and raised an eyebrow as if he had said something foolish. "You wish to take the D rank test?" "Yes." She adjusted her glasses and set down the stack of papers she had been working through. Her expression shifted from mild disbelief to a more professional demeanor. "Normally, to promote from E rank to D rank, you must first complete a minimum number of quests. May I see your card?" Rusty nodded and handed her his card. She took it and stepped away for a moment. After about a minute, she returned and handed it back. "It seems you have managed to meet the requirements. So, does that mean I can become a D rank now?" "Not quite. The next step is a written exam followed by a battle test with one of our veterans." Oh. He had not expected a written exam before getting a chance to demonstrate his combat skills. But once he remembered that he had 2 blabbermouths inside his helmet who could probably handle the test for him, he was ecstatic. Compared to the last test he had faced, this one already seemed much easier, at least on the surface. "A written exam? Of course. You'll have to pay the fee to take the test first." "A fee?" Rusty tilted his metallic head at her. His voice carried the curious tone humans often used when they were confused. "How much?" "2 silver." She answered while already pulling out the necessary forms. There was a strange glint in her eyes, the kind that suggested she had just roped in a sucker. Rusty would soon realize that passing the adventurer test would cost more than just 2 silver. "This is only for the initial written exam. You'll have to pay another 2 for the combat portion later. That's standard procedure." "Standard procedure? Are there any more fees?" Rusty sensed something off about the conversation, and as he suspected, the payments were far from over. "Oh, silly me. I almost forgot. After the test, there will be a fee for issuing your new adventurer card. Let me guess. Another 2 silver coins." "Oh, how did you know?" "It was a guess." Rusty muttered his answer while touching the satchel where he kept his coin purse. He had spent most of his money acquiring his lair and had only received a single silver coin for defending the city. Fortunately, he still had just enough to cover the fees, though it would leave him with only a few copper coins. "I won't have anything left to buy materials for my smithy. I have to hand it to these adventurers. They're truly ruthless when it comes to things like this. No wonder the only requirement is money." A burden commented with a cackle. Before coming here, Rusty had been worried he might be turned away. In the previous city, the Adventurers Guild evaluated a person's level to determine whether they were a worthwhile candidate. With his possession skill, he could display the status of his human head, which was still only at the level of an E-rank adventurer. Fortunately, there didn't seem to be any such requirement in this city. As long as he paid, he was allowed to take the test. So they just let anyone sign up without limits just to collect all these fees. Of course. That's the entire scheme, dear Rusty. Look how pleased that woman is to take your money. These tests aren't really about finding capable adventurers. They're about generating income for the guild. I wouldn't be surprised if they deliberately made the tests harder than necessary. Rusty already knew the humanoids leaned heavily into their obsession with money. As a monster, he saw currency as nothing more than a tool. But to these people, it seemed to be their entire purpose. He didn't really understand why so many of them hoarded vast amounts of coins without any intention of spending them or using them to improve themselves. For him, money had value only because it could be traded to enhance his weapons, strengthen his body, or expand his magical abilities. It had no other meaning, and he didn't need it just to survive. That's not true. The guild needs money to operate. These fees are just a way to make sure adventurers take it seriously. Not every city has enough funds for identification devices. At last, Alexander had heard enough and chose to speak up. It was true that the identification skill was rare and usually had to be replicated through magical means. The higher a person's level, the more advanced the magical device needed to verify it, and those devices were quite expensive. This is just the lesser evil. The guild already employs adventurers, and this system gives them a chance to guide new prospects and help train them. Ha! Of course you'd defend these greedy lesser races, hero, but we both know that's not the real reason. Rusty wasn't sure whether it was simple greed or a calculated precaution, but either way, this was the only path forward. He had just enough money to get through the process, yet the first hurdle already felt steep. Compared to him, everyone else seemed older and more experienced. He had spent time in the Soul Forge reading books, but most of his study had been focused on crafting and magical research. When it came to adventuring, he still knew very little. Should I sign you up for today's test then, Mr. Edmund? Today? As Rusty considered whether he should study for the test, the woman's next words hit him like a bombshell. The test is today. Yes. Isn't that why you're here, to take the test? When does it start, exactly? In about 4 hours. If you'd like to use the guild library to review the material, you may enter after paying the fee. Rusty looked in the direction she pointed. A door stood there with a drawing of a book on it. What if I fail the test? When would the next one be? Oh, if you fail, you may retake it next month. A whole month? Yes. We're understaffed here, so that's as often as we can administer the tests. The woman replied while fixing her glasses and soon continued while hovering with a pen over some paper. So, should I sign you up? She asked again with a smile. Rusty hadn't expected this sudden turn of events, and the situation was far from ideal. As things stood, he doubted he would pass the written exam without at least some knowledge of the material. Just as he was hesitating, one of his guides raised his voice. Have you forgotten in whose presence you are, my dear Rusty? A burden was hinting at something, and after a moment, Rusty understood what he meant. Oh right, there was that way. Are you confident you can do it? Ha, who do you think I am? One glance is enough. What are you two talking about? Alexander didn't seem to realize what Rusty and a burden were talking about, but a decision had been made. Even if Rusty failed, it would only cost 2 silver coins, and the next test wouldn't be available for another month. Earning money through selling monster parts was an option, so there was no reason to turn it down, especially since he had a way to get through it right away. Sign me up. The woman nodded and used his card credentials to add his name to the list. From a quick glance, he could tell there were a few other participants already signed up. Very well. You have 4 hours. You'll find the study room past that door. Also, if your tamed monster eats any of the books, you will be held accountable. Gleam, who had been poking her head out, did not seem amused by the comment. Don't worry. Gleam won't do that. Right, Gleam? Hear that? Gleam wiggled her antennae, but the guild receptionist clearly had no idea what she was saying. Take this, and good luck. The test will be through that door, so make sure to return in 4 hours. Now, please move along, other people are waiting behind you, Mr. Edmund. Rusty glanced over his shoulder and saw that a small line had formed. The adventurers behind him looked rather grumpy, so he stepped aside and took the piece of paper handed to him as confirmation of his test registration. Then he headed straight towards the library and grabbed the door handle to open the entrance. The library door creaked as it opened, letting out a faint cloud of dust that tickled Rusty's non-existent nose. Inside, the scent of old parchment and dry wood filled the air. Books were piled on every available surface, tables, chairs, even the floor, like someone had once tried to organize them and simply given up halfway. A few flickering candles dimly lit the room. Gleam scuttled ahead of him, her silvery carapace reflecting the faint light as she inspected the room with curiosity. I'm not sure. It doesn't look like anyone has used this in a while. Are these books really going to help me? Rusty spoke as he followed his friend to one of the tables. The room had clearly been neglected. Dust clung to the shelves, and many of the books were falling apart. It seemed the adventurers rarely used this place for study. Still, he had already paid the 2 silver coin fee, so there was no turning back now. How does it look? Can you read it? Ha! These lesser races have no respect for literature. So typical. The left side of Rusty's visor began to glow as a burden moved closer. The technique they planned to use for the test was straightforward. Rusty intended to rely on a burden's photographic memory. He had already demonstrated his ability to memorize maps at a glance. All they needed to do was flip through every book and scroll they could find. In theory, that should be enough to get Rusty through the exam. They also had Alexander, a former hero and someone familiar with the guild, who could help fill in any missing knowledge if needed. Well, what do you think? Just keep flipping through them. This is nothing for a demon lord. Rusty didn't waste any time. He grabbed the first thick book from a nearby stack, its spine cracked and faded. Gleam hopped up beside him and tilted her small ant head in curiosity. Although she was well suited to learning magic, she couldn't understand the written language in regular books at all. You can't read it, but you want to? Maybe after we're done here, I could try to teach you. While a burden scanned the books at a steady pace, Rusty found himself considering Gleam's question more seriously. Thanks to his merging with Alexander and a burden, he was able to understand the contents in front of him, but Gleam could only recognize a few of the larger symbols used by humanoids. Perhaps later, he could teach her the basics of reading. It might prove useful one day, especially if she ever wanted to dive into magical research. Good, next. A burden's voice brought his attention back to the task, and he turned to the book in his hands. Already? I said next. The demon lord replied, as smug as ever. I don't need to read it. I just need to see it, so keep moving those pages. Rusty didn't argue. He flipped to the next page, then the next, until his hands became a blur. He moved from one book to another, flipping rapidly, barely glancing at the ink before tossing each volume aside and grabbing the next. Books hit the floor with heavy thumps. Scrolls unraveled. Gleam tried to help, dragging parchment across the floor and using her antennae to hold pages open. The small candlelit room quickly descended into chaos, filled with fluttering paper and the strange rhythmic clanking of Rusty's joints. After 2 hours, it looked as if a storm had torn through the space. Rusty never stopped. His arms moved faster and faster, one book after another. He darted between shelves like a wind-up toy pushed to its limit, flipping and shuffling, occasionally muttering to himself or to his guides. What is this nonsense? Tactical formations against goblin attacks. Eventually, a burden started complaining. The books he was forced to memorize were filled with information he had no desire to remember. Stop complaining. This was your idea. Be quiet. Alexander laughed at him while Rusty flipped through a badly drawn bestiary that barely made any sense. A few hours later, the receptionist sighed and stretched behind the front desk. The written portion of the D-rank test was approaching, and she, along with other guild members, would soon be responsible for overseeing it. Once the test ended, participants would receive their results the following morning. Those who passed would move on to the next stage, a duel against a D-rank adventurer. She didn't know who the chosen opponent would be, but she was aware that the guild was making things difficult for new recruits. They were trying to squeeze out as much funding as possible. Is that person still in there? She stood up and peeked over the desk toward the library door, which had remained closed since the armored man entered. Curiosity got the better of her, and she stepped quietly toward the door. When she reached it, she grabbed the handle and opened the door just enough to see inside. What she saw made her blink in disbelief. Books and scrolls were scattered across the floor, some piled in corners and others stacked into towers of paper. Her eyes soon fixed on the only human there, a large man in armor, rushing back and forth between bookshelves. He wasn't reading anything, instead, he flipped through pages faster than seemed physically possible. He would grab a book, open it, flip through every page in a second or two, then toss it aside without a second glance. At times, the ant monster that had come with him would drag a few scrolls over and spread them across one of the tables. Neither of them spoke. The only sound was the constant rustling of pages. She slowly backed away and closed the door behind her, careful not to make a sound. "I'll pretend I didn't see that." For a moment, she considered saying something, but the man's bizarre behavior unsettled her. She wasn't paid nearly enough to deal with strange adventurers who might explode without warning. As far as she knew, the man named Edmund had recently charged into a forest full of orcs and returned alive. He was far too dangerous for her to reprimand and was best left alone. Not my problem. The library was rarely used, and its upkeep wasn't her responsibility anyway. She began whistling and moved on to the next room. The hour of the test was approaching, and she needed to prepare the space for the other participants. The test will start in around 30 minutes. If I'm lucky, this person won't show up and the more of them fail, the more money for the guild. Maybe I'll get that raise. She walked away slowly and disappeared through the next door. The heavy ticking of the old clock in the guild hall echoed through the corridor and soon started ringing, marking the approach of the test hour. Outside, murmurs of suspense hung in the air as adventurers stretched and exchanged last-minute advice. The test was about to begin, and everyone was gathering. People began filing in and were told to take their seats, but the armored man was still nowhere in sight. "Has everyone gathered?" the woman with the glasses asked while glancing around the room. When no one responded, she reached for the door handle and was about to close it. Suddenly, someone came running down the corridor. It was the strange man she had seen earlier, and it seemed she wouldn't be rid of him so easily after all. "Why didn't anyone tell me what time it was?" Rusty clattered down the corridor as he hurried toward the test area. He had been so absorbed in flipping through the books that he completely lost track of time. To make matters worse, Alexander had started whining about the mess they created, so the last 30 minutes were spent trying to organize the books scattered across the floor. "You should have listened to me, Rusty. Why would you bother organizing those books? Let one of those lesser creatures handle it. Stop listening to that fool of a hero. Just be quiet. We made it in time." "Not thanks to you, hero," a burden replied as Rusty sprinted through the corridor, glancing around. In the distance, he spotted the receptionist who had directed him to the dusty library. He quickly realized he was in the right place. Her expression shifted to something close to shock as he rushed in with his newly attained D-rank speed. The woman blinked in disbelief as Rusty came to a screeching halt in front of her, a gust of wind trailing in his wake. The pressure gently ruffled her hair, and she nearly lost her balance as she tried to step back. "I'm here. I'm not too late, right?" Rusty asked while the woman adjusted her glasses and tried to smooth her hair. "Why yes, you made it," she replied, raising an eyebrow. "Good." He nodded and stepped toward the door leading to the testing room, but before he could enter, the woman moved in front of him, blocking his path. "Please wait. Your companion cannot enter the testing room." Rusty froze as she tipped her glasses and looked at his shoulder, where Gleam was perched. "What do you mean?" She tapped a notice posted on the wall behind her. It read, "No summoned beasts, familiars, or tamed monsters beyond this point." The text was printed in bold, and beneath it was a hastily drawn image of a toothy wolf with its mouth open. Guild policy. For safety reasons, all non-humanoid companions must be kept outside during the exam. We've had too many incidents involving overprotective familiars or people cheating by using summoned creatures. Gleam tilted her head, her antennae drooping slightly. "I see." Rusty looked at his companion and wondered how others were managing to cheat using their familiars. Then he realized they were probably doing something similar to what he was attempting. In a way, Gleam's presence worked in his favor because the observers focused on her instead of a burden, who remained hidden as a wisp inside Rusty's suit of armor. "Is there a problem, Miss Thelma?" Just as Rusty was trying to decide what to do about Gleam, someone stepped out of the test room. The man had bright blonde hair, neatly styled as if he had spent an hour arranging every strand. He wore a monocle below his hairline, and one of his fingers idly played with a long mustache. His armor was not as heavy as Rusty's but had been polished to a mirror-like shine. On his shoulder was an insignia that Rusty did not recognize. It resembled the usual guild symbol, which typically featured crossed swords, but this one was different. It showed an open book alongside a wizard's staff, a dagger, and a sword, as if representing several professions united in one emblem. "Ah, Guildmaster Ferdinand, it's fine. I was just explaining the rules to this adventurer." The moment Rusty heard the man's title, he almost stepped back. Adventurer guilds always had individuals known as guildmasters, many of whom were retired adventurers who had ended their careers at a high level of skill. Rusty wanted to use his identification skill, but he knew that highly trained individuals could sense such attempts, which could put him at risk. The man's presence reminded him of the orc leader he had once fled from, and even surpassed the mercenary leader he had previously encountered. It was clear he was dangerous. "This man is strong, Rusty. Try not to act suspicious," Alexander warned him through their shared link. The monocle the man was wearing seemed particularly unusual, radiating a faint aura of mana. Rusty immediately suspected it might be an identification device, which he knew he should avoid. "I know." "Ah." Before Rusty could say anything, Gleam jumped off his shoulder and moved toward the woman named Thelma. "She says that she will wait outside." Rusty noticed that Gleam had understood it was better to follow the rules. The guildmaster watched her descend, then nodded slightly at the explanation. "An interesting creature. Just be sure to follow proper procedure." The man's attention shifted toward a newcomer who approached with a small cage already in hand. The cage was just the right size for Gleam, and it looked as though it had been prepared in advance. "I hope you don't mind, Mr. Edmund. I've already made arrangements for your tamed ant." Apparently, Thelma had anticipated this and taken steps to ensure Gleam would be safely held. Although Rusty didn't like the idea of placing her in a cage again, it was clear they would not be allowed to proceed otherwise. Gleam paused as the memory of her month-long imprisonment returned, but she gave a small nod, accepting the situation for now. "Don't worry. That cage doesn't look like it will be able to hold you anyway." He reassured her through their bond, and she wiggled her antennae in response. Gleam climbed into the cage. As the door clicked shut, she pressed her face against the bars and gave Rusty a reassuring nod. Through their bond, he could sense her emotions. She was calm but slightly irritated, not because she was confined, but because she was being excluded from the test. "Take good care of Gleam. If something happens to her, I assure you, Mr. Edmund, nothing will happen to your tamed monster." Before Rusty could finish his warning to the man escorting Gleam away, Thelma stepped between them. "Now then, we mustn't keep the other examinees waiting. If you would, Mr. Edmund." This time, it was the guildmaster who spoke, gesturing toward the testing room. Rusty glanced inside and saw multiple rows of desks, each with a single chair. Several people were already seated, all of them looking in his direction with different expressions on their faces. He had already caused enough of a scene, so he simply stepped inside. A few people scoffed quietly, clearly unimpressed by the armored man who had arrived at the last minute. Rusty found an empty seat near the back of the room and sat down on a wobbly chair that rocked unsteadily beneath him. A worn quill, a small pot of ink, and several sheets of parchment had already been placed on the desk. He glanced around. Most of the others had begun reviewing notes or whispering last-minute facts to themselves. "Is everyone ready?" Rusty looked up. Thelma was addressing the room. The guildmaster who had been there earlier had already left. Now, only Thelma and 3 others remained. One person sat behind them, and 2 were positioned on either side of the room. They had full coverage of the space, making cheating nearly impossible. "Haha! Is something wrong, Aberdan? This room has a low-level detection spell designed to sense magical fluctuations. Now that you mention it, I did feel something when I walked in." Aberdan made Rusty aware of an enchantment placed on the area. Since Rusty had recently gained more mana-related skills, it seemed his guides were becoming more perceptive as well. "Will it be a problem?" "We will be fine. Our connection is through the soul. Simple enchantments like this cannot detect it. I guarantee it." Rusty had no reason to doubt Aberdan. If anything suspicious had been detected, he likely would not have been allowed inside in the first place. As the 2 were talking, a loud bell rang from the front of the room. "You may now flip over the pages and begin. You have 2 hours. Thelma announced as she turned over an hourglass. Everyone in the room quickly flipped through their pages and began working. Rusty followed their lead. At first, it seemed strange that they allowed him to wear his full suit of armor, with only his visor raised, but he soon realized there was a reason. The people monitoring them were not just ordinary clerks, they possessed special abilities. "You there, get out! You fail! A man wearing a suit of armor similar to Rusty's was singled out. A sharp gasp followed the command, and all heads in the room turned as one of the overseers strode down the aisle. The accused adventurer, a man in dented steel armor with a raven emblem on his chest, froze in his seat, his hand hovering suspiciously near a metallic bracer strapped to his wrist. What? I wasn't doing anything. You're not fooling anyone. The man grasped the adventurer's wrist and pulled it away. Once the device was exposed, it became clear that it had been enchanted. When activated, it projected tiny letters forward and cycled through various writings. The man frowned as soon as he saw it, then stood up and left the room with his shoulders slumped. He was not the only one removed. Shortly afterward, another person was called out, a woman this time. Hey, I didn't do anything, this is unfair. She had a different type of cheating device. Her heel had been painted black to disguise it, but she was actually flipping through something that resembled a miniature booklet, keeping her leg slightly to the side as she did so. Another man was also caught peeking into his clothing and was quickly removed. It became apparent that the overseers did not truly intend to prevent cheating. In fact, it seemed they even tolerated it. This is interesting. So if you manage to hide it well, they will allow it. Alexander remarked while Rusty finally turned his attention to the questions in front of him. It appeared that as long as someone could cheat without being caught, it was acceptable. No one seemed to notice that both of Rusty's guides had begun whispering answers into his non-existent ears while he wrote them down at an incredible pace. Question 1. When encountering a greater slime in the swamp biome, what is the most effective method to avoid its corrosive projectiles? Rusty had encountered slimes before, but he didn't know the answer to this one. Fortunately, a burden did. A greater slime. That's child's play. Still, let's follow the logic of these lesser creatures. For someone like a burden, a question like this could probably be answered through the use of magic. However, most regular adventurers didn't possess magical abilities. They had to consider all possible solutions, both for those with specialized skills and those without. Using anti-corrosive enchantments and maintaining distance was one method, but this question had more than one correct answer. Question 2. List 3 known weaknesses of the Dreadfang Dire Wolf. Question 7. During a coordinated dungeon expedition, one of your party members is afflicted by a mind-altering curse that causes hallucinations and aggression. Describe 3 immediate actions the party leader should take and explain why. The questions grew more difficult and complex as he continued, but his 2 guides provided the answers instantly. They never argued, which likely meant he was getting everything right. What he didn't realize was that others in the room had started to notice him. Unlike most of the examinees, his quill never seemed to stop moving. He wrote with the intensity of someone possessed. That's all. Only half an hour had passed when he arrived at the final answer. Rusty leaned back in his creaky chair, careful not to let it squeal and draw attention. He glanced around and noticed a few examinees looking his way, but most were still focused on their own writing. There wasn't anything left for him to do, yet he wasn't sure what came next now that he was finished. Is this enough? What should I do now? Just raise your hand and say that you are finished. Alexander answered calmly, and Rusty followed the advice without hesitation. He saw no reason to wait, even though only a quarter of the bottom of the hourglass had filled. As soon as he raised his hand, nearly every head in the room turned toward him. I'm finished. Can I go now? You are finished? Are you sure, Mr. Edmund? Thelma adjusted her large glasses and stared at him in disbelief. Throughout the exam, she and the other guild members had observed him closely, watching for any suspicious behavior. They found nothing unusual. He had simply continued writing, never once slowing down or pausing to think. Yes, I am. I see, then you may leave. He rose from his seat, gathered the small stack of papers, and brought them to the main desk. Thelma took them and looked over the writing in astonishment. Even now, she seemed to struggle with the idea that he had finished so quickly. Around the room, several adventurers watched with irritation, still working through questions that he had already completed with ease. Unbothered, Rusty turned and walked out, soon reuniting with his friend, Gleam. With everything in order, he left the guild behind while the test continued inside until the final grains of sand fell from the hourglass. A stack of papers sat on the edge of the desk, but the woman was more interested in the one she had just graded. It belonged to the strange man named Edmund. From the way he spoke and carried himself, he seemed unaware of his surroundings, not someone who appeared particularly intelligent. Yet, for some reason, she could not find a single flaw in the answers he had given. She was certain that no one else in the group had submitted better responses. You look out of it, Thelma. You should eat something. As she stared at the graded paper, someone spoke to her. A tall man with messy hair walked into the room, holding something that looked like a large sandwich, stuffed with meat. He took a bite and continued chewing as he moved closer. Behind him, a large canine creature followed, clearly interested in the food and drooling heavily. Thank you, but I need to watch my waistline. She replied to the man as he approached, squinting slightly when she noticed the trail of breadcrumbs falling from his sandwich. The crumbs barely hit the floor before they disappeared into the gaping mouth of the dog-like creature walking close behind him. The man stepped closer and glanced at the perfect score on the paper in front of her. As he continued to chew, a grin slowly spread across his face. Edmund.